A lot happens before I actually start working on a full-scale piece in the studio. I do field work, drawings, and tests. When it's time to work at full scale, I know what I want to do and I like to have things set up a certain way. I put on a lab coat to keep my clothes from getting dusty and make a final review of my notes. In this case, I'm starting with a piece of 24 by 24 inch 6mm thick tecta with cold worked edges. It's elevated on little cups so that I can get my hands under the glass to move it around without disturbing the top surface. I'm going to start by getting out 18 cups of 0137 French vanilla powder, and I'm going to apply that as uniformly as I can across the surface. Each cup contains about 35 grams of material, so I'll know how much total material I put on the piece by the end. And you can see that you can't even see the sifter in the screen here. Now you can see it, and I'm holding it up really high and holding it firmly in one hand and tapping the back end to get a very nice uniform distribution of material. I take off my lab coat and turn the piece around because I can't quite reach all the way to the back edge to get a nice clean uniform application across the whole thing. And I took off my lab coat so I wouldn't accidentally drag my sleeve or part of it through the material. You can also see that I'm wearing a respirator to keep the particulate from getting into my lungs. And you can see that material falling over there. And now I'm taking a piece of tecta and setting the rough side down on top of that field of powder to emboss it with the texture from the back side of the sheet. And I'm going to lift it up a couple times and drop it just to get it to squeeze some material out the edges to create both the texture and some disturbances. And then I'm going to go in with my finger and actually start making markings that correspond with markings in a drawing I've done in preparing for the piece. And I didn't quite like what I saw out of the markings with that raised edge to them. So I go in and I use a paintbrush to start knocking them down. But even then, that turns out to be unsatisfactory. So I set down a piece of tecta on that again and emboss it again, and now I'm happy with what I've got. I set that off to the side. I remove those little cups that the glass was sitting on, and then I start to gather all of the overspill material, and I can reclaim it into these cups. And then I put lids on those cups, and I'm going to end up labeling them so that I know what's in there for later if I want to use it again. And then I document what I've done, not just how much material I put down, but how much material I removed. Then I'm going to put about half a cup of 1122 transparent red powder just in select areas. And notice how the sifter has very little material in it. And that gives me much more control over where I'm putting that material. So I can just place it right where I want it to be. And you'll also notice that I'm holding the sifter in some cases very close, some cases further away. And now I've reclaimed that material and I've transitioned to a different color. This is 0146, which is steel blue. And I'm actually putting that in mostly the same places where I put the red. And now I am going over the whole thing with 2 cups of 111608, which is the transparent turquoise powder, and that is a copper-bearing glass, so it will have a slight reaction with the French vanilla, which was set down first, which is a sulfur-bearing glass. And I end up reclaiming about a half a cup of that material. Here you can see me loading it into a kiln with a shelf that's been prepared with fiber paper with thin fire on top of it, and that's because this shelf can't be prepared with primer. Now I'm working on the next piece, and you can see that I have a 12-inch by 12-inch maquette, so it's a quarter scale maquette of the thing I'm going to make. And I'm also using my drawings, and I'm going to draw directly onto the piece of glass with a felt tip pen. And that's not to achieve any specific effect. That will actually burn out cleanly in the firing process. I'm putting it there as a guide for myself as I'm going to apply the material and then manipulate it. I start by applying 12 cups of 1122 red powder. And notice again how I was holding the sifter very firmly in one hand, up close to the hopper, and then tapping the back end of it. And you can see that a little bit better here. And I'm just trying to apply a fairly uniform coat of material over the whole piece. And then I'm going to go in and, using a pencil, start to draw directly into the powder in a sgraffito technique, echoing that line that's in the top of the composition, and then doing repetitive marks that follow that basic theme all the way down to the bottom of the piece. And you'll notice that as I continue, the lines get further apart and they get a little bit heavier. So you get some sense of dimension and scale as I do this. Ultimately, I end up reclaiming 2 cups of powder. Now notice I'm no longer sitting on the piece of paper. I'm filling up a syringe with water right now, and I'm going to use that to disturb the surface of the powder I've laid down. And the syringe is nice because if I want to, I can be very precise about where I'm putting the drops of water, and by varying the pressure that I use, I can actually create very small disturbances or very large disturbances. And so right now, those would just be holes that would go through to the clear glass. And now I'm applying 18 cups of 110508, which is the deep plum powder. And you'll see that I can't quite reach all the way across this, so I've taken off my lab coat again. And I'm turning the piece around so that I can reach this other edge of it. And then I'm going to continue applying. And I actually go all the way from edge to edge on this. And then after I've done that, I've taken off my lab coat again so I don't drag it through the piece. And I load it into the kiln. And ultimately, I end up reclaiming about 4 cups of the 110508. Now that the piece is all set in the kiln, I'm going to fire it up, and I'm going to include a drying cycle because I put some water on this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the kiln at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour before continuing the initial rate of heating. Without the drying cycle, the piece could thermal shock during heating. This is because any area that still has water on it will be held below 212 degrees as the kiln starts to heat, and any area that doesn't have water on it will heat at roughly the same rate as the kiln. This means that there would be a temperature difference that could become significant enough to cause strain that could make the piece break. I ultimately fire the kiln up to 1280 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there for 10 minutes before cooling to the annealing stages. The next day I come in and I vent the kiln slowly, and then ultimately when it's at the right temperature, I'm going to open it up and start looking at the work. And the first thing that I'm going to do before I try to take anything out is just review the texture, the color, see if there are any surprises. Feel that surface. And then, because I can't use a suction cup on the surface, I actually have to lift it out by getting my fingers under it. And I'm trying to do it without disturbing the fiber paper underneath it too much. And there you can see that I'm wearing a respirator. That's because all of that thin fire has basically turned to a powder that becomes easily airborne. I then put down a fresh piece of thin fire, and I roll out the whole thing, so I've removed any bumps in it. And I'm just working on the back side of the first piece that you saw. I put down holding agent, and I run it along that line I've drawn, and then I let it drip down. And then I'm going to cover all of that up with 8 cups of 1125-08 orange powder. I then knock it off of there, and I actually end up reclaiming about 7 cups of material. So only one of the 8 cups actually stuck to that. And then I'm actually using this piece of glass as a mask so that I can sift down 4 more cups of 1125-08 in the upper portion of the piece. I end up reclaiming 1.5 cups of that. And then I use that same piece of glass to mask that upper area, and I lay down 12 cups of the 1122-08 red powder in the lower area, completely covering up those drips, which they'll actually be there. Physically, you can see their shadow and relief. And then I come in and I cover all of that with 5 cups of 0146 steel blue powder. Then I reclaim a cup of that. I then use a syringe and water to make impacts, as you saw before, and you can see that in some cases I'm using just a little force, in some cases a lot. So I've got some bigger pock marks and some smaller pock marks. Then I come in and I add 12 cups of 0137 French vanilla powder in the lower area of the piece. And again, you can see I'm masking the upper portion off. I'm going to end up reclaiming 3 cups of that. And then I mask off that lower area. And I put 2 more cups of 1125 orange powder in that upper area. And reclaim my overspill. And then I put about a half a cup just by pinching it between my fingers along those drip lines. Then I go over the whole thing again with water and a syringe to create more impacts and craters. So I'm getting a really heavily distressed and pitted looking surface by doing all of this. Then I'm going over the bottom area again with 1122-08, which is the red powder, about half a cup over the whole thing, just a light dusting, and then I use 0146 over the bottom area for another light dusting. And then I load the piece in, and this is on that fired fiber paper with a fresh piece of thin fire on top of it, and that's important because that will actually emboss the texture that's on the bottom surface and preserve it. And now I'm starting on the second piece again, working on the other side. And I've drawn a line on it, and I put 11 cups of 1119-08 sienna powder onto the piece with the sifter. And again, I find myself not able to quite reach to the other side. So I turn the piece around. And here I'm using a razor blade to clean up the top portion of that composition to get a nice crisp line up there, and then a brush to clean up any overspill. And what I'm doing here is I've decided that I actually want to deviate from the maquette because I had just made another piece that was actually quite similar to that. So I've chosen a different tool to mark the lines into the powder, in this case the finer pencil. And now I'm going to go over that whole thing with about 10 cups of 1108, which is the aquamarine blue. And I'm applying it heavily on one edge and fading as I move towards the top of the composition. And you'll see that after the piece is fired. Now again, setting the piece in to fire it. And again, I'll use a drying cycle of about 1 hour at 200 degrees Fahrenheit before continuing to the top temperature, which is again 1280 Fahrenheit. So the next day, after venting the kiln, it's ready to be opened up. And there we have the finished pieces. And I'm going to look at these again and put on my respirator and my lab coat and then take them out. And then I'm going to take some notes about what I see. It's all part of my documentation process. So if there's something that I particularly like or don't like, I know that and I can use or avoid it in the future. I'm checking all the edges, make sure I didn't accidentally pick up something that I didn't want. And then I'm looking at the piece in mixed light. And here's a studio shot of the piece from both sides, so you get a sense of what it looks like in that condition. And again, I'll document the results for the other piece. And here you can, that fade is very obvious. Holding it up, looking at it from both sides. And I'll ultimately look at this in the mixed light condition. Watch how it changes as it becomes increasingly backlit. So the finished work can be viewed from either side and is quite different from either side, yet both sides inform one another, and then the lighting condition has a tremendous impact.